Wow. I just listened to Dom's orchestration changes for the second movement of Eskimo Bob. Oh, wow. I mean, at once I feel so grateful listening to this. It's so like, and it just feels like I'm assimilating some masterclass here, because it's just experiencing how dramatically something can change just through the process of orchestration. Like the composition is the same, but yet it's totally different. And because it's my music, my relationship to it is just much closer. So my attention just seems to be, because I've reviewed other scores, I reviewed other people's orchestrations, but I'm learning so much, I think in part because of my closeness to it, my relationship to it, and I don't know, I can't necessarily explain it right now, but it's just, yeah, it's just amazing to me to just have these people working with me on this and contributing to something that was created in has such an interesting story to how all this came about, from like a web cartoon in college. But yeah, so great. I mean, part of me, like, for moments, like, part of me feels like, oh crap, like, this is so good, like, you know, I could never do this, or, you know, having these feelings of insecurity. But thankfully those quickly go away, and I you know, and I just remember, like, that I'm learning here, and I just come back to gratitude that, you know, having this experience and having the caliber of people helping me on this project is really helping me to grow, and I can take these things moving forward in my work. But yeah, really happy with it.
So, yeah, the first thing really is harp. I always find it really interesting because I kind of know more about the harp than most other composers, simply because I spent a year and a half working with a harpist to write it was an
Wow.
only an 11-minute piece. It was ridiculous, but it's, it's a classical piece, and I think sometimes with classical music, for some reason I don't know why, but you see it seems to take longer, a lot longer.
Hmm.
So I had to work with her to literally go through every note and every bar, and there were so many things that I just didn't know about the harp then, which I now know. So, for example, one of the things was that they only play with four fingers.
Huh.
They don't even play with the little pinky finger, and the reason being that the stretch between the thumb and the fourth finger is greater than the stretch between the thumb in terms of the angle that they play is
Yeah, yeah.
greater than the angle with the fifth finger. So, and that was something that Mozart didn't understand, because in his harp concerto he wrote imagining that players had five fingers. Even he didn't know. Even he didn't know about it. So I don't feel too bad not knowing. And the other thing is with reiterated notes, of course, they're not going to ring on. So if you've got sort of something like this passage here at the beginning, what I try to do, I mean, you could kind of make it even more complicated with every C being a B sharp. So in other words, it's a different string, so that
Right.
it just means that the reverberation of one string won't cut out. But that's quite tricky to do. I mean, with this sort of thing, the only other option is really to put that whole thing on the viola, if you wanted all of that.
Mm.
But I think it will work. I think it will be absolutely fine. There won't be a problem with that. But that was just one
So you're
issue
saying it's
where
not a problem to play it, it's just that
no,
the sound will be different.
yeah,
Like it won't be as prominent.
yeah. I mean, you could ask a harpist
Okay.
just to go, just play C G C and compare that with B sharp G C C G C B sharp G C C,
Mm.
and just compare the two, and you'll notice
Right.
that the B sharp C just rings out a little bit more. Um,
Got it. Got it.
it's just one of those things that you kind of pick up. as you go along.
Right, because you have to stop the sound to play it again on the same
Yeah.
string.
Yeah. Like a classical guitar player who is doing sort of, is it called apoyando strokes or tirando strokes? The one where they sort of stop the string halfway through. I can't remember which one it is, but
Yeah. And if you scroll to the back to the right, in the violin part, like I really like how you did this alternation
oh,
between,
thanks.
like,
Yes.
rather than just have the violin ones play this C, is that? And
Yeah.
you
So
just have them alternating.
they
What does
alternate.
that sound like when they're doing that?
Um,
Just like a shimmer, or
it's a more of a shimmer. So I mean,
yeah.
this was a question for you actually. So I don't know what half trem means because we don't have that. We
I
don't
think
have a
half
word for that.
trem just means half of the section is playing trem
Oh,
and the other
okay.
is just sustaining. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well,
So it's
that's
just more of like it's just
yeah.
not a full effect. It's a
Okay.
yeah.
That's interesting. So I've kind of gone for a cross between the two of those, really.
Yeah, I
Um,
like what you did. I do. Yeah.
so this one is just measured trem. So they'll go digga 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 digga. So I mean, it will
Right.
sound pretty similar to. It will sound pretty similar to that, really. And then, of course, when it's combined, with violin two. So the idea is that you still got some rhythmic element in there. So it's not complete shimmer because you could do
Right.
that, but actually I think it kind of, because you've got a little bit of motoric rhythm or motor rhythms, it kind of demands that it has a little bit of that element. And then just now, replacing the cello just with a little pulse. So this is an interesting one. It's a sort of type of lure bowing, which is where the player plays on the string, boom, boom, but they sort of pulse through. So they don't actually leave the string, but they have that little pulse. And if you do it quite quickly, you get this sort of lovely type sort of sound. You can't really hear it on Note Performer, but when it's played, you'll notice that it sounds a bit like somebody playing a Vivaldi basso continuo part. It will have that.
So those
sort of
8
nice...
beats are one down bow.
Yeah.
So and they're just doing the pulse.
Yeah.
Okay.
And they're just sort of basically they just add a little bit of pressure with the first finger on the bow to get that little bit of iteration.
Yeah, that's neat. Yeah.
So, I mean, a lot of this sort of what I call filigree, so it just means runs, basically, or little twiddly bits. As long as they're in a scale, they should be possible, because literally everybody who learns an instrument can play scales. So you're sort of safe with all of those. And they sound really impressive, but actually they're extremely easy to do because they've been playing scales since the age of whenever they started learning the instrument. And C major is one of those ones which actually it's a less easy scale than you might think. G major is usually the easiest one.
Sure. What was the reasoning behind in violins 1 and 2 having those rests in certain spots?
It just thins it out a little bit. So when you're trying to thin out texture, so as to make it a little bit more gradual, you literally just cut out notes. If you have this idea of just literally repeated notes, how do you get out of that? What do you do to change the texture of it? And the only thing that you can do is literally just so now I've dissipated the energy. And all all composition and all music, all orchestration is about energy. In other words, what's progressive energy? In other words, what's sort of crescendo, fast, dynamic, getting louder, getting faster and quicker and more texture, as opposed to the opposite of that, which is recessive energy. And you could think of it almost like a sort of positive versus negative. It's not quite like that, but it works very, very well with things like, tension creating chords and chords that create less tension or dissipate tension. So that, you know, obviously dissonance and consonance, that comes under that label. Wide, unusual intervals, for example, can create a lot of tension, and then slower, sort of, you know, stepwise movement can create less tension.
The difference, like when you do the orchestration, is it energetically shifts it, because it compositionally, structurally, it's the same piece for
Exactly the same piece
for the most part. But you add these filigree and this decoration, and just like adds a polish and a shimmer and color and texture. I noticed a lot of times, you know, in the second half of measures, I wasn't doing a lot of things, but you would add like a rhythmic element in the horn, the trumpets or the brass, to just keep things moving forward.
Yes, I think one of the issues, especially if you're used to working on a DAW, is to sort of almost imagine there isn't a grid. And the problem with the DAW sometimes is that there is a grid and everything's divided into semiquaver little blocks of sound. And it's very easy to get sort of quite rigid in one's sort of creative impulse, because you're sort of almost literally boxed in. It's similar even with notation software, where it creates bar lines for you, whereas opposed to manuscript paper has nothing. And that can be quite freeing. And I think sometimes I tend to consciously try and avoid bar lines if I can. But you've kind of done it a little bit as well. So even at the beginning here, which I just basically expanded. So I mean, here I just sort of went for pure unadulterated power, really. It's sort of loud, basically.
I love it.
Yeah. So it's a good example of, you know, building energy in the second half of the bar. So you need something else to kind of, I felt, I mean, I could have just played horns and just crescendoed.
Right.
But they're answering a little bit of a trombone thing here. So if we just take the brass separately, this thing, you might not be able to hear it that well. And a lot of the time, there are two different sorts of orchestration. There's blended orchestration, which is, let's imagine that's Howard Shore, Lord of the Rings. Everything, you know, the cello's always with a horn, which is always with a clarinet or a bassoon. The violin's always with a flute or an oboe. The trumpet's always with another violin. So it's very blended, and lots of instruments do the same thing. Differentiated orchestration is the opposite of that. The melodic role is just in the wind. The harmonic role is just in the brass, and then you might have an accompanying role in the strings. So that it's a bit less obvious in here, because, but generally speaking, the harmony is in the sort of some of the wind, but not all of them, but mostly the brass. Whereas all of the melodic stuff is just in, you know, in the top lines. So this is all unison. And it's an Alfred Newman technique, which was developed in the 1930s, really. But it just means that you get a very clear signal that is the tune. We can all hear that dum bum bum bum, because even though it's harmonized, because it's not harmonized everywhere, it means that the melody isn't clouded by having continuous triadic notes all beneath it all the time. Here we go. Yeah. So it's just one thing that Zach was saying is to reiterate the sort of the connective tissue between one bar and another, and you can just do that by just this idea. Now the reason why the bass trombone or the tuba don't do what these guys are doing is because they become less effective if you put more in them. Actually, by cutting them out, you then accentuate this chord more, because it feels like a textural crescendo going to that note. If you fill up with here, it actually makes the list less impactful. If you think of orchestration being mainly strings, it's strings led. Wind accentuate that. Sometimes they add punctuation points and melodic interest and filigree. brass are the sort of, you know, the added depth of sound and harmony that you get, so that they need to be treated quite carefully. And if you overindulge yourself with continuous notes all the time, first of all, the players get tired, and then they're less effective when they're playing in a session. But also the ear grows tired of just hearing brass all the time. It can be sort of quite difficult to listen to. This is a good example here where we've got the trombone just the tuba just joining those hard notes on beats 1 and 3. They don't need to play these notes. It's another sort of mini example of this.
Right.
But then just in the bass trombone here.
Yeah, that's great.
And it feels a bit freer. This fun bit is it's another C major scale. Nothing difficult about it at all.
Okay.
So in terms of playing, you know, violin is G, D, A, and E strings. Those are the strings that you've got on the violin. So if you put your first finger on the G string, you'll get an A. If you put your second finger, you'll get a B. If you put your third finger in, you get a C. It's sort of, it's quite logical. So here is just 0, 1, 2, 3, and then you change strings, or you could put your fourth finger on 0, 1, 2, 1, 0, 1, 2, 3, 0, and it's actually very straightforward. They have to shift up on this, but that's easy for them to do with pro players. And then I've just added a little bit of piano right at the top just to help it along a little bit. I could have probably added a harp at that point. I'm not sure why I didn't. So I might go back and add one. It's not necessary. I haven't gone through absolutely everything here, but that's just one example. Yeah, and here, the reason why that's not exactly copied is because the piccolo, lower than about that, is very weak indeed. You can't really hear it, so there's no point playing it. And also, if they're playing quite a long trill, they need some breath in order to play that loudly.
And those 2 dots above the notes?
It just means go ticka ticka ticka. So it's a double tongue. So literally they'll go
okay,
like that.
So if you didn't have that there and you were telling them to play those 2, how would they do it?
They would probably do it anyway. It's just a sort of an orchestrator's way of saving time in the rehearsal.
Right, I got it.
So that they kind of go, oh, I know what that means. Because a single dot just means staccato, so they'll go
right.
So, you know, they got a chance to sort of breathe at that point. It's quite a nice phrase for them. Yeah, so for example here, if you want the bassoon to do that sort of motoric stuff, they'll grow quite tired quite quickly. So it's better to dovetail the players. So you've got the second player doing the low note, but then they'll sort of overlap the last note with the first note of the other, and it just means you get a nice smooth interchange between one player and the other. And musicians they know how to adjust, so they'll just play less on that bit because they'll know that they're playing together because they'll probably have the same music. They're very good at sort of making minute adjustments at any given time, so the difference is negligible, really.
Right. But I love those examples of any time you actually have to think about the physical limitations of the player themselves and their comfort and their enjoyment. Like that to me is been such an amazing new world working with an actual orchestra, because you don't think about that when you're doing samples.
Absolutely. There's no need.
Right.
Yeah, which is sometimes the beauty of samples, but of course you don't get the same energy that you do in a live performance. So yeah, having a little bit of harmonic movement again adds a little bit of energy. So now it feels like a minim beat, or a half note beat, dum da 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 dum dum da da da. And then with this, you get a little bit of counterpoint as well. And the reason why that works is that on any note which is tied, it's always good with any counterpoint to have something else that basically percusses the tie, or else it just goes but da 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 But if you go da 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 da, it just adds another bit of energetic interest that
Right.
drives things forward. And also starting on the second beat of the bar, bom 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 bom, means again you have that energy movement. Whereas if I went bum 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 bum
Right.
bum, it actually slows the energy down, because then you've got
Right.
two downbeats instead of just going
Right.
up 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 down. It's a really weird thing, isn't it? But you'll see a lot of the orchestration in this follows that principle by adding something right at the end to then create a better downbeat. And then, as you said before, on the last half the beats, having some other interest and generally trying to vary it every single time it comes around. So here, I don't think, apart from these two bars here, those are exactly the same, but actually those aren't. So you get that constant variety, which again is really important with orchestration.
Yeah, it's really
Here we go.
it's really pleasant to listen to, because you're strong on the lead, like it's not unclear what the melody is.
Yeah.
So around that you can add this textures, that it's like kind of like driving by a different landscape.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So there are three, and really with most orchestration, you go, what's the melody, what's the bass line, and what's the accompaniment? And each of those things need to be controlled at any given point. The bass line, generally speaking, will be in the bass. Sometimes it's in the tuba, but not always. Sometimes it's in the bassoon, but not always. It could also have piano as well. But generally speaking, you're always working from strings as your main idea. So here it's just very simple that it's all in the bass. But you'll notice that the trombones don't do exactly what the bassoons are doing, because they only need to emphasize that half note beat. They don't need to go because it's the equivalent of sort of just overkill, basically.
Yeah.
So those three roles are really important. So melody, accompaniment, and bass line, pretty much. And then as we get to the cadence point, then you get a little bit more of that filigree stuff, which I've mentioned before. So because it's coming to a cadence point and we're reducing the sound at some point, in fact, I need to put a little decrescendo in there, then there's no need to put all of that sort of rhythmic interest there, because it's kind of relaxing now. We're kind of going back to something else, a middle section. So here we've now got a completely different sort of contrast. So so the point about fifths was to do with the violas, so that's why I've done this sort of what seems like vastly overcomplicated orchestration. But it's quite fun, because what we had before was just quavers goes, which again, it gets a bit tiring, and also it's very difficult to play on the viola, an octave lower. Much easier to play on the fiddle. So I've sort of modified it slightly by putting a C in there instead of just go. So we've got more sort of rhythmic interest going along. They're playing trem, but we've also got, so in a sense it's half trem, because we've got some of the other violins playing the same music but not tremolando, and then we've got those which now avoid 3 twos, because they were to play that B flat 2, second finger and a second finger, because they're all a fifth apart. So we don't want that. So that's why you have to subdivide them, because having 2 strings is fine, but having 3, you just have to contort your body to extraordinary depths, which we don't really want. Never make the players have to pay for a massage after their orchestral session. And And then simple things here, for example, that you'll notice that there's no pizzicato on the downbeat, but that's because the cellos can't get there because they're playing arco. So they have to put the bow down somewhere and then pluck, or just sort of put it in their hands. So that's why here the double bass is cut out and then divide on the first beat, because
octaves,
they're kind of doing what the cellos would have done. With enough double basses, I can't remember how you got. I think 4.
We have 4.
Yeah, I mean that's absolutely more than plenty. I mean you can get away with 2, quite frankly, but with this size orchestra, it's great to have 4. Brilliant. So yeah, all of this subdivide is just simply to avoid the fifths, and also it's fun to do because I think it just creates a bit more of a stereophonic field, really, more than anything else. Yeah, it's just an interesting texture. So this one, yeah, another little bit of twiddly bits just to make it a bit light. And actually there is a secondary reason for that, is that when you're going from one section to another section, it's sometimes good to have one bar that sort of brings elements of the next section into the new section. So that, again, it's
like a foreshadowing.
Yeah, and it's a form of dovetailing A with B as well. So it ends up being a bit smoother than if you didn't do it. Because now we've heard the trill, that becomes more natural. If we didn't hear it necessarily, you might sort of go, oh, that's a bit strange. And the reason why I've written floaty is that I think it will mean that the violinists go, oh, like that, rather than go, And then we've got this sort of unusual effect here, which is I've nicked straight out of John Williams' textbook, really. So it's just a way of doing sort of triplets. No. It just reiterates the first 2 beats, and it's an interesting effect. It's amazing that even without the third, you don't need that third beat to make it effective. It's a really weird sort of oral sort of...
especially with the horns doing what they're doing too.
Yeah, exactly, because they're already doing it anyway. Exactly. And then with this bit, we've got a nice sort of piano moment, and then also dum like that in the timp. So you get really nice and just second bassoon as well. So this bit here is often having pizzicato starting on the second beat of the bar. Again, it gives you an impetus to go onto the first beat of the next bar. Bom, 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 bom. It just gives it that little bit of energy, especially when you don't want it to be absolutely overwhelmingly loud. So what else? Yes, I mean, and all of these runs, I mean, again, they're sort of fanfare-ish. Anything in a scale is going to work fine. And we call it block chordal harmony. So it's just where you have everything harmonized with a triad, basically. Occasionally, you might have that sort of idea. So you don't have... So having a D flat is a substitute for having the C. Makes no difference. It just adds some color and just it just makes it a bit more interesting. There we go. And I've done exactly the same thing with the horns. So by adding a little bit of color, so that extra note just means that they have something else to play, and it just adds more sort of harmonic color to it. And again, they're doing exactly the same thing, just triads. In this case, I think in second inversion. The trumpets are in first inversion at that point instead of root position. And again, it's important to have that rhythmic counterpoint, so they all hit that note, because of course it's, you know, the highlight of the phrase. Again, it just means that there's a little bit of imitation is the key to it, and then little bits of counterpoint. So again, having the note on some of the tied beats, bum da 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 bum, and then also with the bass line, bum 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 bum. Another example of that textural idea. Notice that as the timpani comes in, you get even more of that sort of build in this bar here.
Yep.
So it's quite complex, actually. I mean, there's quite a lot going on in that.
Yeah.
But each group is separate. There are 3 strands. You've got the melody, you've got the bass line with a little bit of harmony, but essentially it's the same unit that's doing the same thing, and the third line is the horns. So there are 3 levels of counterpoint on it, which can get a bit confusing, to be honest. But hopefully there's nothing which is getting in the way of it. You know, with the wind, they're not really getting in the way. They're just ornamenting stuff that isn't going on at the brass, because there's enough room to have them. Those triplets here, there's nothing there, so they're not interfering with anything.
Right.
And in fact, here you'll notice that they're just accentuating the trumpet line. They're doing exactly the same thing. And
Yep.
just those little runs there, again, it's just adding another little bit of energy. So it's those sort of climactic points which they can be quite fiddly if you're not used to them, and sort of building them up slowly and getting more familiar with counterpoint, really. I mean, I think that's the key to brass writing, that you know, if you've got different levels going on, that they're all doing something a little bit different, but they're all working as 3 separate units. This is problematic, going from one texture to another, so it's always quite tricky. It's again, this time it's dissipating energy. So this, they couldn't go but and then suddenly on the D string there. So I've actually, you know, broke them off at that point. But they're all doing the same thing up until this point, where the violas do what the cellos are doing, which is actually quite a common device in sort of very old classical repertoire, where the violas actually do the bass line, which is really weird. But it just means they're in the right territory to then do a div A3, which I need to put in. And then we've got a little bit of that sort of John Williams, Star Wars, Starry Night type sort of texture.
Yeah.
And also having those little rubs there means that it has that little bit of sort of, you know, you get a little bit of magic at that point, with wind as well, just sustained. So here's an unusual one where I've divided A3 and then A2. It's an unusual way of writing, really.
Right, but it's okay, right? Because it's a quiet section.
Yeah, it's sort of not religious as such, but it's sort of got that sort of quite sort of let's call it ceremonial sort of aspect to it. I think there's something sort of rather sacred about it, I suppose.
Yeah.
And then just,
I like that oboe line.
it's a bit sort of Spanish, but I don't mind.
Yeah. Which actually is great. In the cartoon that I wrote that I wrote this for, they're actually in the desert right now, so it actually fits perfect.
Oh, well, that's lucky.
It's like Arabian kind of.
Oh, brilliant. Well, that's on an appropriate instrument as well. The oboe always works quite well with that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So this is such a fun little movement. I love it so much. So yeah, flute, and here I've just got, you know, just
I like
adding
that, the little piccolo accent. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just quite fun. And again, just you know, I'm trying to sort of make it easy to play. I mean, you know, they could even do open strings there if they wanted to, but they won't. They'll just play in third position, I would imagine. And it's just energy.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just orchestrating it. So we have it's just orchestrated with other things. And you'll notice all of those things about what we've been saying before about lots of space in the bass, less and quite open trombone sound. You know, often they're in open voicing. The top two can be closer, but this one generally tends to be a sort of fifth, fourth, sixth, that sort of idea. And indeed in trumpets, sort of open voicing at that point. So the tune is bassoons and all the horns, and I've also got violin twos on it as well. So they've got a lot of nice support at that point. Blended sound. And then, yeah, we've gone for a sort of and just having a little bit of suspended harmony on the middle beat.
Yep.
And again, like a lot of the other things, we're building up texture. But you know, there's a definite aim, there's a target, and we're trying to sort of get to that target. So everything that we're doing is building up energy. This time they're short note values and a crescendo. And also when it's combined with the tune, I'm trying to create a percussive beat on the tie, so that it has dum bum 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 bum. So I'm always going for those. You'll notice that counterpoint is always about sort of, if there's not much happening, then you put something in where there isn't much happening. So here we've got quite a long dotted note here, which is why having something else makes it quite nice. Like that.
Yeah.
And it's actually quite straightforward to do. If you get the rhythm first, the notes will follow. They'll almost write themselves. You'll sort of know what to do.
Right.
And often it's that sort of suspended chord. He could do all sorts of funky things, you know, by just simply adding notes to the triad, as long as they're notes that kind of sound good. Basically, you don't need theory for it really, and then it just gets even more ridiculous as it goes on.
That's a nice trumpet line there.
Yeah, and we got this sort of hoedown style strings,
Right.
which I think works really well. I mean, that's going to sound I bet you any money you like, the players will love doing that bit because it's easy to play and everybody's doing the same things. There's sort of safety in numbers. So yeah, and having that is very, very fun indeed. They love playing that sort of thing. Trumpets is quite high, so if there's a problem, then we'll just take the top note of that and just do that. It's as simple as that. And then we get this sort of big grand finale.
Right.
With a nice sort of timpani solo and little side drum, snare drum solo as well, which I think works quite nicely. And then just this big sort of crescendo at the end, really. With a cascade. Yeah, those sorts of things are quite interesting. So, you know, horns basically holding the same note as that. It's a sort of a thing that you see in Britten's 4C interludes, for example. He's very good with that sort of brass cascades. You get... and you'll notice that there is quite a lot of, you know, it's all about open fifths, you know, all of that. So you get this really nice open sort of fifth chord, but notice again the amount of space between that note, which is a ninth, and then another fifth, then fourths, and things a bit sort of closer together. So that's really that, and then it just sort of reiterates and then goes back into the thing that we've already sort of talked about. So the only real main difference is right at the end, where we just go into a double time, sort of half speed rather, climactic point by this point. Like that, and with a big sort of ending. With, again, just a little bit of filigree at the end here, just with the flute, the sort of piccolo joining.
Thanks for going through all of that.
Great piece. It's really good fun. I mean, it was good to do. And I hope it's been useful for you as much as it has for...
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's a lot for me to digest for sure.
Yes.
And I've already been studying the score and going through the things you've done and comparing it to the previous orchestration. And, you know, it's a great lesson for me to see. 'Cause, yeah, I mean, I feel like composing it, like there's a lot of, I get to a point where I'm kind of tired and I don't get to all these ideas. Like, okay, I got it. And and basically you've done a really great job of kind of getting a sense of texturally, like, and color wise and mood wise, like what I was trying to go for. And I feel like if it was just performed the way that it was straight orchestrated, what you got, I feel like it would have felt let down. It would have still sounded great, right? But
yeah,
you've really captured the spirit of what I originally had in my head in a way.
Oh, thanks, Eric.
Energetically.
Yeah, I mean, it's been good. I mean, there's enough contrast in the piece to, warrant lots of change, and there's lots of fun stuff, really. Yeah, it sort of took a bit of time to. I think part of it with orchestrating, you sort of try and find a concept really to it. So you have to sort of get inside the music and the intent as much as you can, and then kind of work on that basis, and then sort of craft the arrangement so that there's a curve to it, so you get sort of highs and low points, and enough. Those sorts of things, they can't be loud all the time because otherwise it just gets too much. I mean, even things like actually, Duel of the Fates is a good example where you've got lots of textured layers, sort of ostinato layers, but they gradually build up, and then they have these sort of climactic points, sometimes with choir, sometimes without choir, and this sort of thing. And it's important that, with any orchestrating, that you can't write,
that way forever.
42 pages of that. I mean, that would just be so tiring.